Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a discussion about food supply and security issues related to the pandemic. This is a super important issue, and it touches people's day-to-day lives in so many ways. I'm Catherine Blaisbaum, a national reporter with the Globe and Mail, and I've been covering food security and supply chain issues since the pandemic started. I'm excited to be your host and moderator for today's discussion, but first, we have a few quick housekeeping notes. If you're having technical difficulties, as I apparently was at the beginning here, please just enter your question into the tech support and Q&A box, and someone will respond as soon as possible. In terms of audience questions, we just want to say thank you to those who sent queries ahead of time. For those who haven't yet, you can still do so by asking a question using the Q&A box on the webcast. We'll take a few of your questions closer to the end of the moderated discussion. And on that note, we actually received tons of questions ahead of time and would like to get to as many as we possibly can. So we've decided to extend the webcast by about 15 minutes or so to allow a little more time. If you have to leave by the original end time of 2:15, please don't worry. We will be sending out a recorded version by link so you can catch up on what you may have missed. So let's introduce our speakers. These are people that I and my colleagues have turned to for help in understanding what the heck is going on in the food space as we cover the pandemic. So first, I'd like to introduce Randy White. He is president of Sysco Canada, a global distributor of food products. In response to food supply chain issues arising from the pandemic, Sysco Canada earlier this month launched an e-commerce business to sell directly to consumers. And this is a company first. Next, we have Diane Brisebois. She is president and CEO of the Retail Council of Canada. The council is the largest retail association in the country, representing more than 45,000 establishments. The council's membership accounts for over 70% of all retail sales in the country. We also have Sylvain Charlebois. He is the senior director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. His current research interest lies in food distribution, security, and safety. He has authored 5 books on global food systems. So now that everyone's here and we've got sort of the intros out of the way, we're going to just sort of start with the moderated discussion here. And Randy, I'm thinking we can maybe begin with you. We've all seen the images of empty grocery store shelves and have had trouble procuring one ingredient or dry good or another, whether that's flour or dried pasta or yeast, baking powder. What's going on here? Is there really a shortage of food?
Well, thank you, Catherine. Great to be here, and certainly a great topic today to share thoughts with all of you. To your question specifically, I'm just going to start off by saying the answer is no, there is no shortage. And really what we're seeing and what we've seen, because it is rapidly changing by the day and the week, but over the last 6-7 weeks, we've seen truly a shift in consumption, consumers reacting to the coronavirus and making decisions to change their consumption behavior. And it really is remarkable. And so when you think of food consumption in Canada, we're very similar to the rest of the world. We enjoy food that we bring into our homes from farmers and local producers. We bring it in from grocers. We also enjoy food at restaurants and dining out establishments. And when coronavirus hit, there was quite a shift because we couldn't go to restaurants any longer. And if you think about the numbers, there's a significant amount of consumption that actually takes place in food away from home establishments. And literally over a few days, that shifted to all grocery, all at home, and all those types of things. We saw shortages, as you said, in flour and sugar and other items, and including bathroom tissue and paper towel and whatnot. We've actually seen that all come back now, and the supply chain of grocery wasn't used to that level of volume, but upstream in the supply chain, there is a very stable food supply. And as we go forward here, I do want to say to all of our viewers or listeners here that we have a very stable food supply in Canada. It's really a matter of us in industry, all parts of industry, managing that supply chain well as people shift their consumption behavior throughout the coronavirus situation.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's not really a matter of production, but rather distribution. So I'm wondering, given that that's sort of the world that you live in, I'm wondering if you can sort of tell us about whether you've found that there are some areas or communities or populations in Canada that maybe are more vulnerable to having trouble accessing food, maybe not because of shortages of food, but because of challenges getting the distributions to them.
And I will add some color to that. We at Sysco, we were watching very closely as people stopped dining out very briefly. And in fact, we're seeing that all come back now at food home delivery and takeout is really becoming popular more than ever. But the first 4 weeks of the coronavirus and the pandemic behavior change, we literally stepped forward as an organization noticing that there were shortages in grocery stores. We realized there were shortages in other areas such as Indigenous communities of Canada, in the food bank side of food, and many other feeding charities across Canada. So we stepped forward to say, hey, we're over here. We have an enormous inventory that's available, and can we be of assistance? And so it was really interesting to step forward and get phone calls as to how significant those supply chain issues had become. And since then, we've managed to fill gaps in the supply chain, supporting grocery, supporting Indigenous communities. In fact, we right now, as we speak, we've stood up over 100 supply lanes into over 100 Indigenous communities to fill a void that was not being taken care of because of the shift in consumption. It's very stable now as we speak. But on top of that, the food bank side and all of the different feeding program organizations, they're still struggling with donations. But as far as obtaining food, we're actually in pretty good shape. And I will say this as well as I just kind of close these comments. You know, there is continuing to be emerging hunger relief gaps that all of us need to pay attention to. And there's enough food. It's really a matter of knowing where those are and stepping forward to find ways and solutions to support those.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that color around some of the challenges that some of the communities are having, and also for your comment about how there's a big uptick in the home delivery and takeout. I feel like people, like, the novelty of cooking in is wearing off, and people are wanting the help of having the food delivered or picked up. Deanne, you have your eye pretty squarely, obviously, on grocery retailers. We've talked, a little bit about what people are seeing or maybe not seeing on grocery store shelves. They're looking different than they did pre-COVID. Can you tell me a little bit more about sort of what's going on there?
Well, Randy covered some of the issues that grocers have been faced, especially at the beginning of the crisis, because there was overbuying. In some cases, it was referred to as hoarding. People were bulk buying. And so we saw a lot of empty shelves. And that was simply because people were buying the quantities that usually were purchased, let's say in 2 weeks, were purchased in 2 days. So it took a long time for grocers not a long time, but it took a while for grocers to refill those shelves. What we're seeing now in grocery is, I think, what we're going to see going forward. And by that I mean that the physical space is changing in grocery stores. For most of the listeners who do their shopping, hopefully safely and respecting social distancing, they'll see that many of the stores have signage on the floor. Not only signage to remind consumers of social distancing, but also signage to do like one-way aisles, which was unheard of before, but has become very popular. We've also seen a mix of merchandise because of the demand. We don't believe, and our grocers certainly don't believe, that people are going to go back to pre-COVID. Some of the trends that we're seeing now, such as baking, such as eating together as a family, we believe will continue. They may not be as strong as they are now, but they will continue to be popular. And that will change the mix of products in the stores and the placement of those products in the stores.
And what about about, I think I've done a little bit of reporting on this, and I think my colleague has spoken with you a bit about it, but, manufacturers choosing to sort of shrink their product portfolios to increase efficiency at their plants, or, the food manufacturers running out of packaging and having to rely on old packaging or different packaging. Are those things that we might see for a little while longer, or are they here to stay even, these shrunken portfolios, do you think?
Well, it will really depend on how long it takes for the restaurant sector to get back on its feet. As Randy mentioned, at one point, consumers were hearing that there was a lot of food waste. We certainly saw in the media the issue of eggs or milk, but in fact, it was mostly the products that were directed to the food services sector in restaurants. And so it took a little while to change the packaging so that it could be acceptable in a grocery store environment. So for us, if you go into a restaurant and if you look at the back, you'll see those huge bags of flour. They're also labeled differently. They're specifically for the commercial market. Well, that's not as easy to transfer that and put that in a grocery store. In fact, there are rules and regulations in Canada that disallow that kind of packaging in a grocery store. So the challenge was not because there wasn't enough flour, but there wasn't enough of the packaging that would be acceptable in a retail environment. So when consumers saw some of the shortage, they may have thought it was the product itself, but in fact it was the packaging. One of the trends that we're seeing though, and we think the manufacturers and the grocers are being very creative, is also looking at bulk packaging, which has become a bit more popular. So I think what we're going to see is the regular packaging that we as consumers are used to when we buy flour, for example, or yeast. But we're going to start seeing some larger quantities, so larger packaging, as people get used to buying in those quantities. So that's what we're expecting. But in fact, there is no shortage. It's a question of the amount of time a manufacturer has to readjust its assembly lines so that it can start producing packaging for the grocery retail market and for consumers.
Yeah, the bulk point is interesting, especially if Canadians who are out of jobs or seeing their wages impacted might be sort of looking for those sort of cost savings that are associated with those bigger volume options. Yes. Sylvain, I'm hoping to sort of chat with you now and talk a little bit about the food supply chain in the near term. You and I spoke, it feels like a year ago, but I think it was not that long ago, a matter of weeks. And we were talking about agriculture and meat processing and things like that. We know that cattle producers are facing disruptions, and COVID-19 has impacted meat processing plants. Cargill and JBS both have been hard hit, and together they process 70% of the country's beef. Looking at that example or others, just wondering if you can sort of talk to me about what food shortages we might see on the horizon that we haven't maybe yet confronted.
Well, thank you, Catherine. First of all, before I forget, I want to thank, I know there are a lot of people listening to us right now, a lot of people who are part of the food industry. Thank you for what you're doing. What we've seen in the last 6-7 weeks has been nothing short of a miracle. So thank you for feeding us, essentially. To go back to your question, Catherine, I'm not concerned, as Randy and Deanne, I'm not concerned at all about shortages. There'll be hits and misses here and there, of course. If you're looking for a specific cut, you may not get it, but it'll be coming. What's going on with the beef industry is a product of what consumers want, which is affordable beef at retail, essentially. And it's been going on for years. Consolidation in the industry was inevitable, but I think COVID is really helping us better understand what the real problem is. And I think the issue is around processing, whether it's beef or something else. There was a crisis going on coming into COVID when it comes to food processing. In Canada, every day we have lost 12 jobs a day, every day since 2012. So, and nobody spoke about it. And right now we're kind of paying for it. Ranchers are paying for it. Hog producers are paying for it. There's going to be huge backlogs as a result of the fact that we don't have proper food processing in this country. And hopefully coming out of the pandemic, we'll be able to resolve this.
Yeah, there's also sort of the issue, I'm assuming, around consolidation, especially on the beef side.
Oh, absolutely. So both High River and Brooks, both facilities that I visited several times when I was out west, and I was actually I was asked to be part of the 2012 XL Foods investigation during the largest recall in Canadian history. And frankly, in processing, I would say that both Cargill and GBS Canada are responsible companies, but of course there's no playbook to deal with a pandemic, and what we're seeing right now, in most cases where plants had to be shut down, is that risks outside the facility were as important as risks inside facilities, and it caught a lot of companies off guard. Some actually have done a great job managing the effects of the pandemic, but some are still struggling, unfortunately.
And let's maybe just sort of stick to the sort of agriculture related world for a minute. We've been following the issue of labor shortages at farms due to the slowed flow of temporary foreign workers into Canada and the requirement that they quarantine for 14 days upon getting here. What's your take on that situation, and sort of how are things going?
They're going. I think at the beginning, the federal government did a good job working with provinces trying to resolve this issue of foreign workers. We hire about 60,000 of them every year. My guess is this year we'll probably get 35,000. We knew we were short. Provinces were out there trying to recruit Canadians. But the problem is that some of the policies coming out of Ottawa are detrimental to farmers trying to hire Canadians back on farms, unfortunately. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Ottawa has considered most issues related to COVID through public health lens exclusively. And I think we've reached a point, especially when it comes to agri-food, that we'll need to think about economic recovery, or at least proper support for all elements of the supply chain, starting with farming, because right now they're desperate. I don't think we're going to be seeing any shortages as a result of what's going on with labor at farm gate, but it's going to be complicated for sure.
Yeah, and I'd like to, I'm going to come back to you on that a little bit. I know there was a bit of a development in the news today. Deanne, one of the issues that has come up in the reporting is Canada's reliance on other countries for a lot of its food. Canada is a net exporter of food, but not across all categories. And I'm wondering how the pandemic is impacting consumers' views on locally produced food now that people are becoming kind of a bit more conscious about where their food's actually coming from.
Well, there's two parts to that answer. One is we've seen an ongoing increase of support for local growers through the grocery retail ecosystem. And that will continue. Quebec leading the way, but we're seeing a lot of other provinces also making great strides. And so the grocers, both independents and large chains, are key to the success of local growers and local farms. And secondly, we're seeing an increased interest from consumers to understand where the product is grown, and to also try to support as much as possible those local farms and local growers. But as I said to you in a previous conversation, I think that sometimes as consumers, we assume that everything can be grown in Canada, but not all can be. And so, bananas, oranges, and the likes. So we do have to rely on imports in order to be able to provide that incredible assortment that most of us enjoy when we go to a local grocery store or a chain. And then there are other products that can be grown at a greater scale in Canada. And I think there will be much more attention paid to that in the future. But we will continue to rely on external markets because we are a colder country and there are certain fresh produce that we can't, or vegetables and fruits, which we can't grow here. You know, you were asking me about pricing, and the other issue is, some people sometimes wonder, well, why are the oranges more expensive now than they were a couple months ago? And it's sometimes as consumers, we kind of live in our bubble and we forget that, for example, a couple of years ago, a hurricane hit part of Florida that destroyed most of the orange groves. So there was no supply, which means there was a high demand and low supply and the prices went up. So there are a lot of things sometimes we don't consider when we're looking at prices, where the product is coming from, and three, if it's available in Canada. But saying all of that, all our surveys show that local procurement is growing, is becoming much more important for both consumers and grocery retailers.
I suppose it will sort of remain to be seen whether that's durable, as as I mentioned earlier, people are confronting wage decreases, hits to their salaries, and whether they'll be willing to pay a little bit more for those locally produced foods. Randy, just sort of to bring you in on this because I know you and I have spoken before, and you mentioned that it's sort of a big issue, the notion of global trade, and just how sort of long and spiraling the food supply chain can be. I'm wondering if you can talk to me a little bit about that, and what kind of squeeze Canada's feeling, and where sort of the choke points are, or the vulnerabilities, I guess.
Okay, Catherine, I would like to make one comment on Diane's comments a moment ago.
Yeah.
One other, really a third dimension to the Canadian food consumption equation, if I'll call it, is really this notion that we are a very ethnically diverse nation, and as we have continued to see our ethnicity grow in just enormous percentages every year, that has also created an element of interest on consumption. And so to the point earlier that not everything can be grown in Canada, or at this point may not be able to be grown in Canada, there are demands in consumer demand that actually looks for products from other parts of the world. It's a big interest, and it's a positive interest. And so, we facilitate that. The grocery industry does, the food service industry does, while balancing that with local. And, I think most of the listeners and viewers today would agree with me that they enjoy that diversity in their availability of product. And so, we need to think about those things as we think about the one dimension of local versus not. And I just wanted to make that distinction. And so your question I think, was really around the pressure points, given the complexity of the food supply chain. And there was a couple of comments made earlier around packaging and the importance of packaging. I actually am the chairman of the GS1 Canada Board of Governors, and we represent all different grocer, food service, manufacturing organization in Canada, and we set the coatings and standard rules that are adopted across the industry. And it is really interesting that, first of all, Canada has adopted one of the highest levels of information on our packaging, and we can do better, and we're working to do better. But in addition to that, there's processes that need to happen before a product can safely be brought to market. And, I take comfort in knowing as a Canadian that when product is offered on a grocery store shelf or at a food service distribution company in a restaurant, that there is a significant amount of food safety work that is done upstream to bring product to market. And it's not as simple as trusting a farmer and putting it in a restaurant. And unfortunately and fortunately, it doesn't work that way. But all these steps have created a very time dependent process. But at the end of the day, we have safe, quality food that makes its way to the consumer, and then the consumer can get information from all of that on where food comes from, what the ingredients are, what the risks are from an allergens perspective. All of these things add up to the complexity, and they are important. In addition to that, there's many provincial regulations in terms of some of the protein products that can't cross provincial borders, and whether that's good or not good, that's an opinion. But those things also create more complexities. And for example, early on in the pandemic, as a supply chain distribution company, we were seeing certain provinces start to have a sight line onto near-term shortages in some of the protein products, and other provinces have a significant oversupply available. And so, given the regulations between provincial borders, we worked hard with the provincial governments and the federal governments to bring that to the attention of those groups for consideration along the pandemic, to allow us to move all industries to move product between provinces more freely but safely. But those things do exist, and it really creates, some would call it a bureaucracy. I would call it a very much needed veil to help us create a very safe food environment with good information. I'm sure there's improvements we can make over time, but that complexity does create demands for time before products are brought to market.
Yeah, it really sounds like people have had to be exceptionally nimble.
Catherine,
Well, sorry, go ahead, yes.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in and say that, when we talk about the availability of affordable food across the country, if there's one thing that this pandemic has taught us, and we hope that governments speak with each other and work collaboratively, is that it is sometimes more difficult for a vendor to sell a product from one province to another than it is to export to another country. And that, at the end of the day, ends up costing more money for the consumer. And so one of, I think, the lessons learned, and we've seen some great collaboration now, Catherine, between the provinces and the federal government in regards to trying to take the red tape out of the regulatory system so that the flow of goods can go from east to west in a much easier, faster, and economic way. Sorry.
Thanks for that, Deanne. And you also have given me a great and easy segue, because I was going to sort of bring Sylvain back in to talk a little bit about sort of the role of government. There's states of emergency right now in most of the provinces. We've seen some governments like BC assuming power over the supply chain. Just today, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture asked Ottawa to provide an agriculture and agri-food emergency fund of $2.6 billion to help maintain food security in the country. Sylvain, I'm just wondering if you can sort of talk to us a little bit here about the role of government as we confront this unprecedented situation. I know that's a very big question, but I'm sure you're up for tackling it.
No, I appreciate the question. I'll respond in two ways, I guess. We are in the middle of a crisis, and I think the government or governments would need to respond appropriately. I think the Canadian Federation of Agriculture's call today is measured and appropriate. I would want to remind our listeners that in the United States, the farmers received $19 billion in funding to support them through COVID. And so far in Canada, they've received little. So I would say that CFA's call is appropriate. Now, I wouldn't stop there, though. Beyond COVID, I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think we will need to think very seriously about processing. Both Deanne and Randy have spoken about food prices. Let's be honest here. Food prices are going to go up. The food inflation rate this year will likely exceed 4%. In an environment where a recession will occur. There'll be an economic downturn. So a lot of people will be left behind, unfortunately. But the reality is that according to the Food Consumer Products Canada Association representing food processors, 76% of food manufacturers right now have seen an increase in costs over the last 4 to 6 weeks. So implementing physical distancing measures, hires, training, new packaging, as Deanne mentioned. All of these costs are accumulating, and right now processors are forced to go back to their clients and renegotiate terms that were negotiated months ago. Eventually it will catch up to consumers, and on top of that, consumers want local foods. So as you can imagine, Catherine, there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure put on the food industry to deliver what consumers want. But at the end of the day, we have to question ourselves, what are the appropriate socioeconomics of food moving forward out beyond COVID? And currently, Canadians have access to the 5th cheapest food basket in the world relative to income. So Canadians have actually had it pretty good. Variety, access, affordability, safety. But after COVID, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of system do we want? And how do we want to serve Canadians moving forward the right way?
Catherine, let me add.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Deanne, go ahead.
That's okay. I was just going to add a comment based on Sylvain's remarks. And we need to also understand that one of the huge impacts on price, setting aside the fact that gas is that transportation costs may be much lower because of oil prices. There's another big issue that we're watching from a grocery retail perspective. There are a lot of processors and large manufacturers where close to 50% of their business relied on restaurants and food services. And so let's assume that they've only been able to keep 10% of that business alive. That means they've lost that, and it may take a long period of time to get it back. They still have similar operating costs. They may have to make some substantial changes to adjust. So we're watching that very closely because we're concerned that that may have a negative impact on the cost of goods sold. So I think at the end of the day, the sooner the economy gets back on its feet, setting aside some of the elements that Sylvain brought up, the better it will be, both in regards to selection of goods, but also competitive pricing. But unfortunately, there's so many different elements around what makes a price that it's difficult to predict what kind of increases we might see in the future. But I think Sylvain is right. If we expect that the prices will remain low, I think we're being a bit naive. There are a lot of external factors that are forcing increases in cost of goods sold.
Well, Deanne, maybe we'll actually sort of stick with you here. And this is like a little bit of a pivot to sort of where we're going next on the retail side of things. How are consumers shopping right now? How much are they purchasing online? What are they purchasing online? If you can talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, there are lots of people, I think, that have been doing online grocery shopping for a very long time. But I think there are probably lots of people who are doing it now that never thought they would, like parents and grandparents. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit about the trends. Yeah,
it's interesting because Canada is somewhat different from the US and the UK and most of the EU. We were seen as being behind from an e-commerce perspective, and certainly from a food e-commerce perspective. E-commerce in Canada, if you look at all of retail, up to end of 2019, only represented 7% of total sales. And within that basket, so that 7% being 100%, grocery only represented 1%. So it's no longer the case. Our projections are that grocery will be in fact closer to 7 to 8% by end of year, 7 to 8% of their total volume, which is enormous. We're talking billions of dollars that this industry represents. And in general, if we look at all of retail, we're projecting by the end of next year that online sales will represent close to 18 to 20%, which is huge. The challenge in Canada is that a lot of the grocers were starting to build their infrastructure to compete in the online world when the crisis hit. So, we were hearing stories about consumers going online where the grocers say it's going to take a week for us to get the merchandise to. So they've had to invest very quickly, scale up very quickly in order to try to respond to the demand, which continues to be challenging. And they've done that also by pick and collect, curbside. So they found some creative ways, but there was so much, the volume grew so quickly, the kind of volume that you would usually see over a 12 to 18 month period happen in about a 6 weeks period. So there's no infrastructure that it could have sustained that growth. However, saying that, I think the grocers also saw a silver lining by increasing their investment, increasing their teams who are dedicated to online shopping. And so we're starting to see that flow a bit better. But it is going to take a while. But, your question is an important one. It is a segment that will continue to grow. And we do think that a lot of consumers will want to go back to the brick and mortar environment. But based on what we're seeing now and some of the sentiment surveys that we've done with consumers will probably shop less often. So today, because of self-isolation and social distancing, they're shopping once a week versus 2 to 3 times a week. When they go shopping once a week, they buy more. So the size of basket is larger, and it is also online, to your question. And we think that that is going to stay to a certain degree as we move forward. So we believe that online grocery is going to play an important part in that, in the future of grocery in Canada.
How will that sort of future play out differently if you're looking at like a smaller retailer versus a bigger one, do you think?
Well, smaller retailers can, if there's one area usually where there is a level playing field, is online, only because of the technology and some of the platforms that smaller retailers can join in order to have that infrastructure. So that allows them not to make the kind of investments that maybe a large retailers would make to build an online presence. But small grocers have a great opportunity to be extremely innovative. It can be a home delivery. It can be, again, curbside. Small grocers also have started developing exceptional relationships with local growers and local manufacturers to provide that kind of assortment, so they can do that both in store and online. Obviously, in order to make it very profitable, usually you require scale. And in retail, be it grocery or general merchandise, the last mile is the one that everyone struggles with. So delivery can be expensive, and it is competitive. So it is a challenge, but there are great opportunities for the smaller grocers.
Before we move on to audience questions, is there anything that that the panelists sort of wanted to touch on that hasn't been brought up yet and you kind of want to make sure we talk about?
Yeah, if I may, Catherine, I just want to add to what Deanne mentioned about e-commerce. COVID's legacy is very powerful. What we're seeing right now is a food supply chain becoming more and more democratic. Everyone will have a shot at the consumer if e-commerce becomes an option, a real option in people's minds. Everyone will have access to the marketplace. Before COVID, barely 3% of the population were buying food online on a regular basis. And based on some of our numbers, we are expecting to see more than 20% of Canadians buying online, buying food online on a regular basis after COVID, which is really big. It's huge. And so we're going to see a lot of pivoting going on. Sysco Canada is a perfect example of that, of this huge pivot. If you would have asked me 2 months ago if Sysco Canada was going to sell online to consumers directly, I would tell you that you're smoking good cannabis. But it did happen. It did happen, which is incredible. And
Randy, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, we're seeing farmer groups, processors doing the same thing.
A very good couple of points here. I did want to add, and I'll speak to that last point, but Deanne mentioned the 10% food service dropping to 10%. Just to be clear, the food service business in Canada, restaurant industry business, was initially hit hard, and we've seen that snap back dramatically. Is it where it used to be? No, absolutely not. But it's actually surprising at this point how robust and stable it has come back and continues to come back by the day. So very fluid, but certainly will it go back to the level it was at in the next weeks or months? That remains to be seen, but it's definitely come back to a very strong number. And a lot of that has to do with the restaurateurs adapting and pivoting themselves. We've done a lot of work to help them understand how to be a great home delivery business. All the different third-party delivery, last-mile delivery organizations out there have really worked hard to help the restaurant industry finish those deliveries of meals, and we're really seeing that grow. And then the public is tiring of cooking and baking and all those things, at least for the moment. Particularly the last couple of weeks, it's been very strong. But to the point of e-commerce, we also believe, and our industry is looking at this very, very sharply. We're a business-to-business. We have been a business-to-business organization since our inception, and to open the door a crack to the public and now work on the B2C business-to-consumer channel, and to do that online for Sysco was something we hadn't thought of before, didn't think it was relevant. And as we saw grocers struggling with products during bulk buyouts and stock-ups, I don't want to call hoarding, but we saw an opportunity to fill a gap, and we are absolutely surprised at the level of attention that this has brought. And so, we've got this rolled out right across Canada. We are not here to compete against the grocer. We're actually here to fill an interesting segment, and it's the foodie segment. It's the segment of the public that wants access to products, local products, international products that are available to enhance their experience with food. And will this be a sustained channel for Sysco? That will remain to be seen. We're just getting started, but for us to pivot, we are excited by it. At the same time, our priorities lie in supporting the restaurant industry, supporting our restaurants to get back on their feet, supporting our restaurant industry, healthcare industry that we also support to be successful through the balance of this COVID crisis. And I will end with this comment that, I want to assure everyone that this is a very exciting time despite the crisis. As you see, Sylvain said it, the democracy of food buying really come to the table here. There's so many choices now on how you can obtain food, and I think that's a good thing for our overall food supply chain.
Good to see the silver lining as people are juggling their children and their work and their bills. So thanks for that. I am keeping an eye on the clock, and so we are going to move to some audience questions now. So just a reminder to people who are listening along, if you have a question, please type it in the question box in your webinar console there. So just to start, I'm just looking here. Okay, there's a question. It's sort of tweaks back to some of what we covered at the outset, but it's going in a slightly different direction. This question is for distributors and retailers of the country's food supply. To what extent can supplies be distributed without the mass purchasing and hoarding of goods seen earlier this year? Could any mechanisms or approaches be agreed upon by retail competitors so there is some uniformity of purchase limits?
Sorry, I had you. Yeah, I had you on mute. That's an interesting question because when all of this started and there was a rush to buy, a lot of retailers put limits on the quantities that could be purchased to ensure that there was enough for the customers coming through. And in fact, some of the provinces passed some rules or edicts that disallowed retailers from putting limits on the merchandise sold. So, you know, it's interesting. Most grocery retailers want to make sure that there are enough products to be sold for consumers who are visiting their stores. We don't expect, though, saying that, as things start going back to the new normal, we don't expect to see that kind of rush buying as we used to. So I suspect that it may not be required to have this kind of harmonized rule across the country in regards to the amount you can buy and when you can buy it. Those are usually put in place during dire situation, certainly at the beginning. But we know that there were retailers in some different regions of the country who were having difficulty in getting the product back into their stores to fill their shelves that had put limits. But it was on and off, and it's not something that the grocery retailers would see as being necessary going forward. And you know, there's also the element of competition. Grocery retailers are very competitive. They want to provide the greatest value and the greatest offer to their consumers. So they will decide going forward how they should sell the product. And but to answer that specific question, we don't think that's an issue that will need to be addressed going forward.
Okay, another question here. Can the panel speak to how broadline distributors and retail grocery chains can better work with small-scale farmers to ensure both food safety for Canadians while also taking advantage of the abundance of local food options that exist through small farms across Canada? So I guess it's a sort of a question about how they can.
Yeah, if I may, Catherine, actually, since the beginning of the crisis, so in my career, I've actually mentored a lot of startups over the last 20 years or so, and over the last 6 weeks, I've been contacted by quite a few companies looking at marketing commodities coming from small farms directly to consumers. Going back to this e-commerce reality, it could provide an opportunity for several farms, distributors out there, processors to sell directly to e-commerce. In food service, I could see the rise of ghost kitchen as well. We could see more farms or processors getting together to look at how they can set up a ghost kitchen and sell directly to consumers. There are several possibilities that can happen after COVID. And as Randy said, I actually do see a different landscape, a different competitive landscape for both retail and service. And it's pretty exciting, frankly. Once things stabilize, I actually do expect a lot of different groups to get together and look at the market, look at the consumer very, very differently. You see, 7 weeks ago, many Canadians experienced a profound sentiment for the very first time, probably in their lives. A lot of Canadians out there felt food insecure. That was a very powerful sentiment. And I think that sentiment, that influence is going to last for a while. And people will reflect on how they consume food and they'll look at other options beyond what they were doing before the crisis. And that will provide opportunities.
Yeah, we've seen opportunities as well. Sorry, Catherine. I think what the grocery retailers have been trying to do, especially the larger chains, they've been trying to find ways to facilitate their local franchisee or their store manager to support local growers or local farms. The challenge sometimes is scale. There's absolutely no question that grocers want to support local growers, but sometimes they have to change the way they buy so that they can satisfy the local grower and satisfy the consumer. I.e., sometimes these local farms are small, so they can't at times they can't serve the entire chain. So there are ways the larger grocers are developing systems internally to allow for stronger support. But I think as we get through this, I suspect that the farms will get stronger. We're seeing more investment. We're seeing more recognition, more support. So with growth comes scale. And so I suspect they'll play a much bigger role going forward for both consumers and grocery retail.
Thanks for that, Deanne. This is a question, well, it's for anyone who'd like to take it. What advice do you have for a remote community to ensure that reasonably priced food continues to be available for our most vulnerable members?
That continues to be a challenge, but yes, I'll stop and I'll let someone else answer and I'll jump in later.
Yeah, well, Amazon sells food to the north effectively, actually. So there are always possibilities here and there. It is a challenge. I mean, Canada has 37 million people in one of the largest countries in the world. Distribution, I think, or the power of distribution has been underappreciated for several years. And that's why we're seeing a lot of consolidation in many different sectors. So when we think about food or food networks, we have to think about remotely located areas, including northern communities. And we've tried through government programs, and several have failed. So the only way to do it is to build technologies, build networks, and of course making sure that these people actually do have options. But so far we've seen in this crisis even that Amazon is able to distribute food and equipment much more efficiently than government. And so I do believe that the private sector may have some solutions to provide in this case. And
Randy, you guys were you were doing some of this, so maybe you can speak to that.
Yes, and if I can add, absolutely, it's interesting as we've stepped forward to get involved in more Indigenous community support, which isn't the very first time, but in the size and scale we've stepped into, it is significant. We've discovered this, the way this question is posed, we've discovered the challenges even more. But I think it comes down to this, as Sylvain just said, we have the networks, okay? So Sysco as an example, we have the networks. We come to the end of the line, the end of the road, the last mile that then leads to these remote communities. And a remote community in Canada doesn't mean it's down the highway. What it means is that down the highway, there's a ferry terminal, a boat dock, a helicopter pad, an airport, a rail line where we then transfer product and it makes its way to that remote community. And there are literally hundreds of these outstanding Canadian communities that pay the price of moving goods to these remote communities. The key here is volume and consolidation. And so if we are acting as a business in isolation at that end point in that last mile, the cost becomes higher than optimizing, bringing goods together. So one of the solutions that comes to mind that is very clear to us is local communities need to purchase freight in an abundant way and use consolidation as a way to lower the cost. And so food, riding on an airplane with other goods, averaging out that general cost is one area to focus. But that is represented from the community backwards. And then on top of that, as you think about affordable food for all Canadians, there is an element of we'll call it social support that should be considered that may also lend a financial discount that creates an equal playing field. But you can't argue with the realities of Canada. The majority of our population lives across the Canadian border with the United States, and the further north you go, the further away and more remote. And it's a reality. So I'm not saying we're ignoring it. What I'm saying is we need to work harder to consolidate. Business consolidates to lower costs. We need to do the same thing as a community, working backwards to pull goods and services into those communities.
Thanks for that, Randy. Just keeping an eye on the time here, we've got probably one more question. And this one's interesting, something I actually haven't admittedly thought too much about. Beef, pork, and poultry, etc., are obviously important to the food supply chain, but will you discuss Canada's fisheries sector and specifically the aquaculture sector?
I can jump on that one. I'm in Halifax, after all. I'm close to the ocean.
I was going to suggest you, so great.
As I'm sure everyone knows, that last week, I believe it was on Saturday, Prime Minister Trudeau presented a $62 million program to support fisheries and seafood, to support them through this crisis. It is a very global industry. Most Canadians may not know that most of the fish and seafood we eat in Canada is actually imported, and most of the fish and seafood we actually produce gets exported. So it's a very global system. But I'm looking at the industry here in Canada, and I think the support provided by the government was overdue. I think it was needed. The challenge that we're facing, or the industry is facing, is the foreign workers program issue. You may not know that New Brunswick, which is a big player in fisheries and seafood, has decided to block foreign workers as of yesterday, and that creates a huge challenge for that sector, unfortunately. And there are a lot of family businesses at stake as a result of some of the measures happening. So you have, on the one side, you have, again, lack of coherence in a time of crisis can absolutely be devastating for a sector. And in New Brunswick in particular, that's what's going on. So, but overall, it is a very important sector. And perhaps because of the fact that food prices are going up, it could actually get Canadians to consider more fish and seafood in their diets moving forward, beyond the trifecta of meat, which would include beef, poultry, and pork.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that. We're unfortunately going to have to leave it there. We're just sort of coming up on the end of the time here. So on behalf of the Globe and Mail, I just want to thank all of our speakers, Sylvain, Randy, and Deanne, for joining us today and making the time to be here. And thank you also to everyone for listening in and sending in your great questions. As I mentioned earlier, everyone who registered for this webcast will get a link to the recorded version. So you can always sort of listen back if you feel like you missed anything or want to learn a little bit more. So thanks again from the Globe and Mail, and stay healthy.